Let 'Em Eat Space by William Gray Beyer. Part 2. Such a world we thought we had found in your own planet, but we knew that your sun gave off but few of the emanations that made life possible to us. I refer to the cosmic rays. Accordingly, we set up a tremendous projector at our south pole, which always faces toward your system, to compensate for the deficiency. It was necessary to make this projector powerful enough to manufacture many times the quantity of rays that anyone Cepheid emits. This, of course, to compensate for the greater distance. We were still faced with the problem of taking care of our immediate increase, for it would be many times 10,000 years before your planet would be suitable for us. But, tragically, nature solved the problem for us. There came an extended period of volcanic activity on this planet, which resulted in the deaths of thousands and thousands of jaspers. Our population fell off considerably rather than increasing, but eventually normal circumstances returned, and once again we multiplied. After a few million years, it was decided that your planet should have by then developed the proper sort of plant life to support our race, and accordingly an expedition was sent out to investigate. But something had gone wrong. The Earth was found to be inhabited by many forms of giant reptilian life, some of them carnivorous. The whole project was therefore a failure. The world was obviously unsuited to us. It was then necessary. Whoa there. Slim again interrupted. You said the expedition found gigantic reptiles. The age of saurians was way back in the Triassic and Jurassic periods, almost 200 million years ago. Oh, yes. The projector was built long before that, somewhere in the Carboniferous era. Well, why didn't you shut the thing off? Once you saw that the Earth was covered with the reptiles, Ham wanted to know. But we couldn't do that, explained the amoeba, sounding a bit horrified. The reptiles require the rays, and to cease sending them would have been murder. And we invent such words as altruism, was Ham's mumbled comment. But the projector was no drain on our resources or our time, Jasper said deprecatingly. It required no effort to maintain, for it operated by transforming useless emanations of our sun into the desired one. But what finally caused it to cease functioning? Inquired Slim. The mad ones turned it off. Why, I can't say, for in the vicinity of the machine there is an abundance of gain which they value. But they are quite irrational, and it is useless to conjecture on their motives. Several of my people have made attempts to start the mechanism, fearing that its failure might be causing suffering on your system, but each time they were driven away by the voracious mad one. Slim looked at Ham and screwed his face into a ludicrous expression of thoughtfulness. After several minutes of this, he evidently came to a momentous decision. It looks as if we had better take a trip to the South Pole, he announced. And the sooner, the quicker. Ham, who had also been giving the matter some thought, saw a few objections. And if the place is crawling with Jasper's demented relatives, what do you propose to do? I've always been superstitious about being eaten. Don't think I'd like it, nohow. Contrariwise, supplemented Slim. I don't intend to be eaten. I've got an idea. Most anything can happen now. All right, you start the ship, and our pal will show the way. Won't you, Jasper? Of course, agreed the amoeba. But I don't see how. Naturally not. Beings with your finer instincts couldn't possibly think the things I'm thinking. But let's see if my idea isn't okay. You said that the mad ones reflect only infrared from the surface of their bodies and absorb all the visual light vibrations. My deduction is therefore that such beings would not be able to stand much light. It would burn them up, inasmuch as light which is absorbed becomes heat. Am I right so far? Yes, I believe you are. The mad ones are almost entirely nocturnal creatures. They never come out in the full light of day, and only occasionally in the late afternoon, when the rays of Propus are red and weak. He hesitated. Well, but if you are contemplating the use of light rays to kill them, I think I would rather not have anything to do with such an undertaking. But I assure you, my dear Jasper, I am by nature as gentle as a lamb, which reminds me I was bitten by a lamb once. But he, of course, was a very vicious lab. Here is the situation. We, as humans, wish to start up the cosmic ray apparatus, and that is just what we intend to do. Now, if in the act of so doing, we are attacked by anybody at all, we must defend ourselves. Self-preservation is the first law of nature. To you, that takes the form of flight. But inasmuch as we are not endowed with the gift of levitation, we would have to fight to defend ourselves. And knowing what we might have to fight, we would naturally prepare ourselves accordingly. Now, that doesn't sound like premeditated murder, does it? We certainly are not asking them to attack us. In fact, we will go out of our way to avoid them. There was a long minute of silence while Jasper weighed the finer moral aspects of the situation. He finally came to a decision, but it was not so much Slim's words as his own sense of responsibility which was the balancing factor. On Slim's line of reasoning alone, he would still have refrained from having any hand in an act which might result in violence. But there was the annoying thought that the beings of the solar system were suffering because of a condition which was the direct responsibility of his race. And, in all justice, he must make sacrifices to help them, even if it meant going counter to his own moral convictions. In a few minutes, the ship was silently winging its way southward. Slim was at the controls, with Jasper hovering at his shoulder, while Ham was busily hooking small atomic generators to a pair of powerful searchlights. When he was finished, he tried them out, producing a light to rival the sun in brilliance, but still he seemed a bit dissatisfied. He stood surveying his handiwork for a minute, decided the lights were too heavy for easy carrying, and set about to correct the fault by attaching leather straps. Suddenly, he stopped work, partially paralyzed by an idea. "Say," he erupted, "what are we bothering with these lights for? Why not do our dirty work in the full light of day, about noon, when the mad ones are under cover?" "Because there isn't any full light of day," Slim informed. "The place we are headed for is the South Pole, and as you should have noticed, this planet rotates on an axis perpendicular to the plane of the eclipse, which means, of course, that the South Pole region has a night and day of the same duration as at the equator, but receives very little light, even at high noon. Therefore, the mad ones are able to travel around without any discomfort all day long." Ham went back to work, muttering to himself. There was one more thing he wanted to know, but he would be darned if he'd say anything, and give Slim a chance to pop out the answer in his superior manner. But Jasper came to the rescue without being asked. Chapter 5. I suppose you have both been wondering why this planet does not possess the usual polar ice caps that would be expected on a planet so far from its luminary, he telepates. Wait, but the reason has to do with our failure to find a suitable world to colonize. I told you that shortly after setting up the cosmic ray projector, we were subjected to a long period of intense volcanic activity. This had two effects. Vast quantities of carbon dioxide were released, causing the average temperature of the planet to rise, and the added heat caused prolific vegetable growths, most of them unsuitable for our consumption. Jasper waxed happily professorial. So abundant was the undesirable plant life that it choked out most of the sort of vegetable food we require. As a result, and this in spite of our decreased numbers, there came a shortage of food. To beings of our sort, however, this is not really serious, for when we eat less, we merely lessen our bodily activity, and we found it very easy to do this, for the volcanoes caused a thick cloud blanket to cover the planet, nullifying the pulsations of Probus and removing the necessity for our periodic flying excursions. But perhaps the greatest result of the activity was to teach us that we needn't ever multiply to such numbers that the planet cannot hold us. For with the lessened food consumption and lessened activity, we found that our division period was lengthened to more than 1,000 years, and inasmuch as our mental keenness was not impaired by slowing down our bodily activity, it was decided to continue at the new rate, even after food became plentiful. How about the sun's pulsations after the volcanic activity ceased? Ham inquired. "We had learned our lesson," replied Jasper, "and thereafter we took steps to control our climate so that all portions of the planet are ideal for our own existence. It was simply a matter of the amount of suspended dust particles in the atmosphere and providing means of controlling the proper percentage of carbon dioxide. That is why we have no terrifically hot torrid zone and also no polar ice cap. The machinery for maintaining this ideal climate is housed in those hemispherical structures you were so curious about and is completely automatic and self-repairing. The ship terminated its swift flight in a land of broad plains covered by dense but stunted shrubbery. The light of Propus was dim and reddish, coming from such an oblique angle that it lost most of its brightness in the thick blanket of atmosphere through which it passed. Slim set the ship down a short distance from a structure similar in general appearance to the one they had intended to cut into the day before. This one, Jasper assured them, contained the cosmic ray projector. It differed from the other buildings in two respects. For one thing, it had a small opening in its lower rim, left there, Jasper told them, so that they could gain entrance to make adjustments in the apparatus. He explained that while this planet would continue to face its south pole toward the solar system for many ages to come, there was a slow, continual shift taking place, which necessitated correcting the aim of the projector every few millions of years. The other difference was that the upper portion of the dome was made of a darker colored substance, a better conductor of the rays, they were informed. Once outside of the ship, Ham strapped one of the lights on Slim's chest and showed him where to turn on the switch. Slim, in turn, strapped the other on Ham. There were no blobs of shadow in sight, and they decided that the mad ones were temporarily elsewhere. But to warn them of any unexpected attack, Jasper hovered in the air behind them as they headed for the opening in the structure. His brain, keen in telepathic reception, could pick up the jumbled thoughts of the mad ones, long before the two men could detect their presence by the sense of sight. And besides acting as lookout, it was necessary for him to go along to start the machinery of the projector. He had decided against attempting to explain its intricacies so that they could do it themselves. But short as the distance to the building was, and clear of menace as the plane seemed to be, there was nevertheless plenty of time for distant mad ones to detect their presence and propel themselves to the spot. Like Jasper, they could attain terrific speeds. The trio had barely gone 20 feet when Slim and Ham were again almost knocked senseless from the intensity of the horror emanations from Jasper's agitated mind. "Protect yourselves," he shrilled, the terror thoughts waning, and in their stead coming sensations of urgency and desperation. The two men whirled and darted their eyes all over the landscape, trying to see the shadows that would reveal the mad. Possibly only a few seconds passed until they saw the inky blobs hurtling toward them, but those seconds were stretched into minutes by their terrified minds. But if their brains were temporarily paralyzed by the strength of Jasper's emotions, their condition didn't continue once they had sighted the enemy. Twin beams of blinding light centered on the nearer of the shadows. When it struck them, clearly outlining their dead black forms, they seemed to shrivel, hesitate for an instant, and madly plummet to the ground below. "It works," Ham exulted. "You're a genius, my boy, albeit a stupid sort of genius." He felt obliged to temper the praise a bit, considering how easily Slim's head was apt to enlarge. But he had spoken too soon. It became apparent that there were quite a few of the shadows still in the way, and that some of these had evidently retained enough intelligence to see the danger in the searchlight. For Ham saw out of the corner of his eye several black streaks fly off to the left of the main body. Divining their purpose, he frantically swerved and caught several of them in the beam from his lamp. But even as he saw them fall, he realized that in the moment that he must hold the beam on them, others were escaping off at a tangent. In a minute they would be coming from all directions. "Head back for the ship, Slim," he urged. "They're flanking us." Slim needed no coaxing. He had seen those oblique streaks of black and had come to the same conclusion. Grimly the two men strode along, hampered by the necessity of keeping the heavy searchlights continually swerving to catch those of the mad ones, who were tearing in from the side. Sometimes one or the other of them would suddenly whirl and face the rear, warned by some mysterious sense that some of the enemy had managed to circle, and each time this occurred they would be rewarded by the sight of one or more of the inky blobs shriveling and dropping. The thought never occurred to them in the heat of the battle that those warnings could hardly be part of their own sensory equipment. But it became increasingly apparent that they never could fend off the menacing mad ones long enough to reach the safety of the ship. The source of the warnings made itself known. Unexpectedly, each man felt a constricting band tighten around his waist and abruptly jerk him off his feet. Both thought the same thing, that one of the mad ones had finally reached them. They struggled frantically to free themselves, as the unseen being lifted them through the air. "It is I," came the reassuring tones of Jasper. "Keep the lights working, or they may get us yet." But in spite of the almost invisible rapidity of their dartings, the searchlights kept the menacing shadows at bay. Several times Jasper was forced to swing one of the men suddenly outward to let him get a shot at one of the blobs attacking from above. But such was the coordination between amoeba and man, made possible by Jasper's mental equipment, that every attempt by the mad ones was frustrated. Once inside the ship, Slim slumped down at the control. "Where do we go from here? We might learn how to build one of those projectors," Ham suggested. "Jasper could give us the dope." "We're stupid? Why, how about Pluto? That's far enough out that a wide-angle projector would cover the rest of the system." Slim snorted his disgust. "Pluto turns on its axis. How could you keep it aimed?" Ham pondered this, discarded it, thought up some more ideas, and discarded them too. He was reduced to mentally kicking himself for having voiced a half-baked idea for Slim to scoff at, when suddenly he thought of another, and put it into words without thinking. "Say," he exploded, "suppose we had managed to start that contraption. What was there to stop the mad ones from turning it off again? Nothing, except that I intended to seal the door over after we came out. The mad ones are too concerned with the business of finding raw meat to be bothered going to the trouble of breaking in. They weren't after us because we wanted to turn on the projector. All they wanted was a meal." Ham paced the floor nervously. Oh, Slim continued to slump. Jasper said nothing and did nothing. Ham, glancing at him, decided he looked more like an oversized sofa pillow than an animate being. But then you could not expect the guy to come out with an idea of how to murder his own relative. His glance then strayed idly to the medicine chest. His eyes lighted up avidly. With a quick stride, he reached the cabinet and jerked open the door. Slim was too far gone in the doldrums even to raise his head at the sound of a familiar gurgle, but he roused himself at the satisfied "eh," which followed. "Where did you get that?" he wanted to know. "Medicinal purposes, old chap," explained Ham. "I'm sick. In fact, I almost got it. That's enough to make anybody sick." "I'm sick too," declared Slim, reaching for the bottle. Fortunately, it was only an 8-ounce bottle. If it had been a quart, it would have probably had the unusual effect of putting the pair of them asleep. Jasper, of course, didn't drink, and if it had been a quart and they had gone to sleep, then Ham wouldn't have become talkative, and Slim wouldn't have given birth to his prize idea. Such a catastrophe would very likely have changed the course of history on 2 solar systems. But, as the Chronicle has already recorded, it was an 8-ounce bottle, and Ham did become talkative. At first he merely marveled that a machine that was potentially capable of operating for millions of years was stilled merely because they couldn't cross a few feet of ground to start it up. From that, his verbal wanderings progressed to wonderment at the methods used to supply power to run the machine all those millions of years. He had completely forgotten Jasper's explanation of that point. Then he began to reminisce, in the course of which he covered much ground on the subject of power. "Do you remember," he asked, "back before atomic power was developed?" "Before my time," Slim grunted, somewhat annoyed. He was in no mood to be tolerant toward Ham's lapses. "I'm referring," Ham enlarged, "to the time just before atomic power was harnessed. and shortly after they learned to transmit tight beams of radio power. That was when the Sun Power Company made fortunes for a half-dozen men who had vision. They bought up a vast stretch of jungle land in South America, right on the equator, installed 500,000 selenium light gatherers on poles, and broadcast the power all over the world. Made a fortune selling the receivers. But the clever thing about the idea was the way they managed to put power production on a 24-hour basis, broadcasting power from the sun after the sun had set. Slim, who had again sunk into a sort of apathy after guzzling his half of the bottle's contents, suddenly snapped to attention, Ham not noticing. Yeah, that was pretty clever, he repeated. Hiring 2 spaceships, they were rockets then too, and having them set up an orbit so that a light-reflecting screen stretched between them would send the sun's rays down to make daylight on the night side of the planet. They used to stay there a month at a time, conserving power by dissipating the screen when the sun was shining directly on the Amazon territory. Slim, by this time, was on his feet, striding toward a door which led into the ship's laboratory and workshop. Jasper, suddenly come to life, floated after him. Ham, a bit bewildered but determined not to show it, followed in their footsteps. Slim was already at work with a slide rule and a book of logarithms. After a few minutes he stopped, cupped chin and palm, and frowned. Ham was no less bewildered, but Jasper seemed quite aware of what was in Slim's mind. Power? He inquired. Yes, answered Slim. It would take more than this ship could produce. I would want a screen a lot bigger than the one those sun power lads used. Why? Asked Ham, suddenly realizing what they were talking about. You only need a screen big enough to bathe this particular region, say a mile on all sides, with the full rays of prophet. And while you are up there maintaining the screen, I'll be down here turning on the projector and fusing the doorway shut. Simple, eh? Goofy would be a better word, Slim asserted. Where would you be while I am going up to erect the screen? Ham's face fell. And I suppose, he said lamely. But Jasper, who had been indulging in quite a bit of thought along lines foreign to him before meeting these two representatives of a more primitive civilization, decided to take a hand in the discussion. Why did you wish to make a screen larger than the one suggested by your friend? He inquired. Slim looked steadily at the amoeba. Jasper, old son, I think you know the answer to that. It was my hope that I could erect a screen, a curved screen, so huge in area that it would bathe the entire night side of this planet with intense sunlight. The thing is possible, too, with enough power. I wanted to exterminate every damned one of those mad ones. Why, may I ask? The amoeba calmly insisted. You may, returned Slim, though I think you know the answer to that also. It was because I think you Jaspers are too danged fine a race of beings to be killed off. And that's just what will happen eventually if the mad ones are allowed to continue in existence. While your people are living sedate lives, curtailing your rate of division so that the planet will not become overpopulated, these creatures are madly thinking of nothing but their carnivorous appetite, and dividing at a terrific pace. You have deliberately understated the plight of your people, but I managed to see through your pretense that a reckoning was far in the future. It is imminent. Your doom is on top of you. How else could you unconsciously emit such a strong feeling of horror at the presence of the mad ones? At first I thought it was a revulsion at the thought of cannibalism, but the last time it was much too strong to be merely that. And yet, in spite of that horror, you forced yourself to stay with us and help us out when the pinch came, even to swinging us around to get a shot at the enemy. Say, old boy, did you realize you were fighting? Well, after the way you acted, even if you had the instincts of a wild boar, I would want to do something for you. That's why I wanted to set up the big screen. Chapter 6. Jasper evidently required some time to digest all this, for he ventured no comment. Ham, usually voluble, was shocked into temporary silence by the sudden realization that ever since Jasper had explained the nature of the mad ones earlier in the day, he had been unconsciously puzzled by Hazy. nebulous thoughts about the ultimate fate of the amoebas. Even then, his mind had been toying with the memory of the soul-chilling emanations the amoeba had loosed on the night previous. But it had taken Slim's keen insight to make those thoughts concrete. Say, Jasper, Ham finally exploded. You were saying something about your people never being required to fight any other forms of life in the past. You just rose in the air and fled. But just the same, your flight was an expression of a universal instinct called self-preservation. And maybe when flight won't do you any good, you'll forget your principles and do what any other form of life does when it's cornered. My personal opinion is that you only think you could stand being eaten by a mad one without trying to fight back. Well, I figure that as individuals, you Jaspers will fight when the time comes. The only trouble is that when the time comes that you can no longer run, it will be because the mad ones have multiplied to the extent that they will begin to pick you off, one at a time, by ganging on you. What I'm getting at is that if I'm right, and your people will be forced by the instinct of self-preservation to fight when you are ultimately cornered, why can't you push the calendar ahead a little bit and do your fighting now, collectively, while there is still time to save yourselves? You'll do it in the end, anyway, in spite of your finer instincts. But it'll be too late then. The two men looked at Jasper expectantly, but once again he declined to answer. For a brief moment they fancied there was some mysterious aura surrounding the amoeba. There was an electric tensity in the air that made the silence seem tangible. For a short space they imagined the air shimmered and waved about the figure. But the impression lasted only an instant, and Jasper became the same inscrutable being he always was. His smooth body was devoid of a revealing feature to indicate the workings of his mind. The incongruous thought passed fleetingly through Ham's mind that the amoeba had the ideal equipment for playing poker. He had something better than a poker face. He had no face at all. It'll be too late then, repeated Jasper absently. We must find out. This made no particular sense to either of the men, nor did Jasper's following action. He rose slowly from the floor, as if reluctant to continue, and floated toward the airlock. He hesitated over the spot where the men had dropped the powerful searchlights when they had dashed into the ship. Then abruptly 4 pseudopodia thrust forth and grasped the 2 lamps, while a 5th reached out to open the door. Remain inside, please, he said, and swung the door inward just far enough to let himself through. It slammed shut before any of the mad ones even noticed it had been opened. As one man, Ham and Slim, rushed to the nearest porthole. At first there was nothing to be seen. Jasper was not yet in their range of vision, and the reddish-gray landscape was broken only by an occasional hazy blot, marking the spot where one of the mad ones had fallen in the recent skirmish. Floating in the air were still a few who had not been struck by the light beams, but evidently the majority had moved on in quest of easier prey. Presently Jasper came in sight as he moved slowly away from the ship, and simultaneously with his appearance 2 of the hovering mad ones plummeted toward him. Twin beams of blinding light met them halfway, and down they dropped, seared inwardly by the converted heat from the rays. Jasper evidently didn't invite further attack, for he retreated toward the ship. Ham dashed to the door to let him in, then stepped back as Jasper floated slowly past him and deposited the lamps on the floor. Neither he nor Slim spoke when Jasper silently descended to rest beside the searchlight. Both knew that they had witnessed a momentous event, for Jasper had, without even the driving urge of self-preservation, actually wreaked violence on a living creature. The experience must have shaken him to the core. Gentlemen, Jasper finally broke the silence. My people have come to a decision. I have purposely refrained from telling you this, but ever since your ship entered our atmosphere, you have been under observation. And ever since you began to inspect my body, your thoughts have gone forth to all of my race. I lied when I said that only when you spoke could I hear your thought vibration. You would have realized that if you had remembered how long my people had been communicating by this means. The deception was advisable, for if you had known your mind was being probed, you would have been uneasy and suspicious. At first, we were nearly interested in you as two intrepid travelers, exploring a new world. We are great space people ourselves, and took a kindly interest in you. But before long, your thoughts began to stir up something in our placid egos. You thought primitive thoughts. Struggle and competition seemed to be the very essence of your existence. Your determination to find a way to restore the decreased rate of metabolism in your people interested us. To us, who have lived for millions of years in blissful tranquility, our needs foreseen and provided for without effort. So slothful that we could face our own destruction with equanimity, you, to use your own idiom, started something. Possibly it was an eon-long submerged racial vitality coming to the surface, some vital urge dating back before the conscious life of the race, something from the days when our unisouled ancestors struggled in the primal slime of this planet. But your vigorous thoughts of self-perpetuation have stirred a similar urge in us. We have come to a decision. We shall throw off this slothful inertia which has gripped us for so long, and destroy the mad ones before they destroy us. Slim jumped to his feet with a whoop, and grabbed the extended hand of a gleeful hound. Then they turned to Jasper with the full intention of slapping him on the shoulder, but this being obviously impractical, they just stood and grinned. But before this decision was made, the amoeba continued. It was necessary to determine whether or not a Jasper was capable of killing. Your argument that we would do it anyway after it was too late had to be tested. It was, therefore, suggested that I try. As I once told you, we are alike in our reactions. If it were possible for me to force myself to do violence, then it would be equally possible for us all to do the necessary thing. And as you saw, I killed. You have shown us the way. We shall erect the screen. Our mastery of vibration will make it simple, and maintain it until the last of the mad ones is dead. We can do this without regret, brothers though they may be, for we know that their state of mentality has fallen below that of the beast. Those of the present generation are conscious of but one thing, their appetite. They have no other mental pursuits, so we are fortifying ourselves with the thought that to kill them is no more a crime against our principles than killing the plant life which we use for food. We wish to assure you that this is to be accomplished immediately, and as soon as it is done, the cosmic ray projector will be restored to operation. Now, I must request that you start your homeward journey at once. The thing we are about to do is to us a shameful act for all its necessity, and we would rather it not be witnessed. The two earth-dwellers, however, saw nothing shameful or degrading about an act of self-preservation, and accordingly, like Lot's wife, looked back. In fact, they did more than look back. They stopped the ship well out of sight of any of the intellectual beings of Propus's second planet, and trained a telescope on it. Their point of view, it became apparent, was perfect. They had taken off from a point directly at the south pole of a world of the Jaspers, and were afforded a vision of the complete southern hemisphere. The day side of the planet was a brilliant crescent, vivid in detail, while the night side was a shadowy world. The Jaspers were as good as their word. After a few minutes of watching it became evident that the work was already begun. Slim, working frantically at the adjustment knobs on the telescope, brought into focus a vast cloud, its edges wavering and constantly changing, rising from a point on the lighted side of the planet. Gradually, the telescope brought the image closer and defined it more clearly. Ham gasped as it became apparent that the cloud was composed of millions of Jaspers, rocketing through space at a terrific speed. Neither man had expected anything like this. They had expected to wait several days before anything happened, while the Jaspers constructed machinery to accomplish their purpose. But obviously these beings were too advanced to require any such crude methods. They would make the necessary light-reflecting screen by direct manipulation of the energies thrown off by their son, Propus. Each individual would do his part in constructing the vast reflector. The cloud approached a point several millions of miles above the dark side of the planet, and as it did, the Jaspers which composed it began to diverge, taking paths away from the center of the cloud. The two men scarcely breathed as they watched the magnificence of the spectacle. Each Jasper was taking his position as if with rehearsed precision. The whole formed a pattern millions of miles across. If lines could have been drawn through the tiny points in the pattern, the result would have resembled a circular spider's web of almost unimaginable proportions. Abruptly, the two men slitted their eyes as the vast design flashed into blinding light. Each Jasper, utilizing the accumulated knowledge of a civilization beyond human conception, was throwing off his portion of that huge mirror. The darkness below was suddenly turned into blazing day. The reflector was steady, motionless, and the two men knew that it would be maintained that way until every mad one had given up the ghost. Swiftly Slim pointed the telescope toward the ground below. But as quickly as he manipulated its controls, even quicker had been the action of the light. Scattered from pole to equator were evidences that the menace of the mad ones was no more. Several times the telescope caught images of animals of varying sizes, dead and partially devoured, and each time they saw the shriveled remains of mad ones stricken in the middle of their carnivorous repast. At length the two men turned from the telescope and started the ship on its swift journey homeward. Ham, a few minutes later, was struck with a familiar urge and began to rummage through the supply lockers. He wasn't exactly disappointed when he didn't find any scotch. "Some sight, wasn't it?" he remarked. "Sure was," admitted Slim, bending over a sheaf of charts. "We ought to get a bonus for starting the ball a-rolling." No answer. Silence, in fact, which was a thoroughly unnatural reaction to the mention of increased emolument. Somewhat alarmed, Slim looked up from the charts, and his alarm was not mitigated by what he saw. Ham had found a bottle, a pint one, with the amber approximation of one slug of scotch at the bottom. Yet he had apparently forgotten it, was in fact standing rigid, holding the bottle without seeing it. On his face was an expression of deep bereavement. "For Propos's sake," Slim exploded. "What's happened now? Who's died? Give me that." Ham shook his head mournfully. "I was just thinking of Jasper. Nicest little gent you'd care to meet on any planet. I guess I'm going to kind of miss him." "Oh, that." Slim started a laugh. "Why, he's just—" He paused, nodded. "Yeah," he finished lamely. "Yeah, me too." And then it came, like a faint music seeping into their mind, like a memory, distinct but impalpable. "Are my rays strong enough, Earth gentlemen? We are grateful to you, and I personally shall miss you very much." The two Earth gentlemen stared at each other, nodded slowly in unison. It was the McCoy. "And now that things are already back to normal on your planet, I have begun to think how pleasant it would be to visit you there. Perhaps, at some future time, it would not be impossible." Meanwhile, Ham raised the bottle to his lips, drank exactly half a slug, bowed profoundly, and passed the other half-slug over to Slim. Mother Earth sang happily in her course. The end.